The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the corner office, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany desk. David Chen absently stirred his third cup of coffee while reviewing the quarterly reports that seemed to pile higher with each passing hour. 20 years of building his law firm from the ground up had taught him to appreciate these quiet moments of routine, even if they meant missing another family dinner. The gentle ping of an incoming email barely registered at first. His eyes flickered to the notification, then froze. The sender was his wife, Linda. Subject line, important. His hand still on the mouse, coffee forgotten, as an inexplicable heaviness settled in his chest. Something about that single word, important, felt different from their usual communications about grocery lists or their children's school activities. Linda rarely emailed him during work hours, preferring to text about everyday matters. The last time she'd sent an email marked important was 3 years ago when her mother had been hospitalized. David clicked open the message, his throat tightening at the sight of two attachments, a PDF file and a JPEG image. The timestamp showed 2:47 p.m., middle of the afternoon on a regular Tuesday. Nothing special about the date, nothing to warn him that his world was about to shift on its axis. His cursor hovered over the PDF first. The file name was a string of numbers and letters, formal and impersonal. When he opened it, the legal letterhead of Harrison and Myers Family Law appeared at the top of the page. His eyes skimmed the document, catching phrases that seemed to float off the screen. Petition for dissolution of marriage, irreconcilable differences, equitable distribution of assets. The coffee in his stomach turned to acid. 23 years of marriage reduced to legal terminology and numbered paragraphs. His mind raced backward through recent memories, searching for warning signs he must have missed. The late-night gym sessions, the new clothes, the mysterious weekend workshops, all the pieces were there, but he'd been too consumed with work to assemble the puzzle. With trembling fingers, he clicked on the JPEG. The image loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, as if the universe was giving him one last chance to close the email and pretend this was all a mistake. But there it was, in vivid color. Linda, his wife, the mother of his children, wrapped in the arms of a young man who couldn't be more than 25. They were standing on the private deck of their vacation villa in the Maldives, the same villa where they'd renewed their vows just 5 years ago. The young man was grinning at the camera, sun-bronzed and confident, one arm draped possessively around Linda's waist. She was wearing the blue sundress David had bought her last Christmas, her hair lighter than he remembered, her smile wider than he'd seen in years. The ocean stretched endlessly behind them, the same turquoise blue that had captivated them on their first visit. Now that view felt like a mockery of everything they'd built together. David leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in the sudden silence of his office. The young man looked familiar. He searched his memory until it clicked. Ryan, the personal trainer from their gym. He'd seen him around the neighborhood, always polite, always calling him sir. The realization that this kid had been calling him sir while he pushed the thought away, his hands clenching into fists. The wall clock ticked steadily, marking time in a world that no longer made sense. Outside his office, he could hear the usual sounds of the workday. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the distant hum of conversations. How strange that everything continued normally while his personal life imploded in his inbox. He reached for his coffee, more out of habit than thirst, only to find it completely cold. The scene reminded him of countless mornings when Linda would bring him fresh coffee, worrying about him working too hard. When had those gestures of care stopped? When had they started living separate lives under the same roof? The PDF document was still open on his screen, waiting for a response. The photo seemed to taunt him from the second monitor. Together, they represented not just the end of his marriage, but the death of a future he'd always taken for granted. Retirement travels, grandchildren, growing old together. David sat in his parked car outside their suburban home, the engine off but his hands still gripping the steering wheel. The divorce papers he'd received earlier that afternoon felt heavy in his briefcase, like they were made of stone instead of paper. As rain pattered against the windshield, his mind wandered through the past year, seeing everything in a new, harsh light. It had started with small changes. Linda had always been health-conscious, but last spring she'd suddenly thrown herself into fitness with an intensity he'd never seen before. He remembered the morning she'd announced she was joining the new gym that had opened downtown. "I need to do something for myself," she'd said over breakfast. He'd barely looked up from his phone, mumbling something encouraging while answering work emails. The gym membership had quickly turned into personal training sessions. 3 times a week became 5 times a week. Her trainer, Ryan, had seemed professional enough when David met him during one of his rare visits to the gym. Young, obviously, but he'd shocked that up to all personal trainers being young these days. Ryan had shaken his hand firmly, calling him sir with what he now realized was barely concealed amusement. Looking back, the signs had been everywhere. Linda's phone had become her constant companion, always facing down when she set it on tables. She'd started passwords on all her devices, just being security conscious, she'd explained with a casual wave of her hand. The late-night texts she claimed were from her sister. The way she'd turn away slightly when typing responses, that small secretive smile playing on her lips. Her wardrobe had gradually transformed too. New workout clothes appeared first, then dressier outfits for client appreciation events at the gym. Her hair appointments became more frequent, her style younger, more modern. He'd actually been pleased at first, proud that his wife took such good care of herself. Now the memory of complimenting her new highlights made his stomach turn. The work meetings had started about 6 months ago. The gym was expanding, she'd explained, and as one of their most dedicated clients, they wanted her input on new programs. These meetings always seemed to run late into the evening. Once he'd offered to pick her up afterward, and she quickly declined, saying Ryan had already offered her a ride home. Even then he hadn't suspected, or maybe he hadn't wanted to suspect. David reached into his briefcase and pulled out the photo again. In the dim light of his car, the details seemed even more stark. The casual intimacy of Ryan's arm around Linda's waist, the way she leaned into him, comfortable, familiar. They were standing in the exact spot where he and Linda had watched so many sunsets together, drinking wine and talking about their future. The vacation house had been their dream, saved for and planned for years. They'd finally bought it 3 years ago, a private villa with its own beach access. Linda had handled all the decorating, creating what she called their perfect escape. Now he wondered how long she'd been planning to escape with someone else. Had she already been thinking of Ryan when she chose that oversized shower? When she insisted on that extra-large deck bed for stargazing? Their children's photos smiled at him from his phone's screensaver, Amy in her college sweatshirt, Michael with his high school graduation gown. How would he tell them, or did they already know? He thought of Michael's unusual quietness during his last visit home, the way Emmy had been asking strange questions about his work hours and whether he was happy. A dog barked somewhere in the neighborhood, bringing David back to the present. The house lights were on, warm and inviting from the outside. How many nights had he come home late to those same lights, taking for granted they'd always be there? He'd been so focused on providing the perfect life that he'd forgotten to actually live it. His phone buzzed, a text from Linda. "I assume you got my email. I'm staying at my sister's tonight. We should talk tomorrow." The casualness of it felt like another slap. As if she hadn't just demolished 2 decades of marriage with a photo and some legal documents. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the car roof. David thought about the upcoming client meetings he'd have to reschedule, the concerned looks he'd get at the office, the whispers that would inevitably start. He thought about Ryan, who was younger than David had been when he first met Linda in law school. The same law school where they'd stayed up late studying together, sharing dreams and plans over cheap coffee and vending machine snacks. Linda had been so young then, full of idealism and determination to make a difference in the world. Somewhere along the way, that idealism had faded into routine, their passionate discussions about changing the world replaced by mundane conversations about utility bills and school schedules. When had they stopped seeing each other and started just occupying the same space? David finally stepped out of the car, the rain soaking through his suit jacket. Their bedroom light was off, but he could see Linda's silhouette moving past the guest room window. Even now, her presence pulled at him like gravity, familiar and foreign all at once. 23 years of shared history, reduced to lawyers' letters and a photo that would be forever burned into his memory. Tomorrow, they would have to talk. Tomorrow, they would have to begin the painful process of untangling their lives. But tonight, standing in the rain, looking at the home they'd built together, David allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd lost and what he never really had. The security camera notification popped up on David's phone as he turned onto their street. Linda was loading suitcases into her white SUV, each movement precise and determined. He'd always teased her about installing those cameras. Who's going to rob a house with 2 lawyers living in it? Now they were giving him a front row seat to the dismantling of his marriage. He pulled into the driveway slowly, gravel crunching under his tires. Linda didn't startle or try to rush away. Instead, she closed the SUV's trunk with deliberate calmness and turned to face him. She was wearing one of her new outfits, crisp white blouse, dark jeans that probably cost more than his first suit. Her posture radiated readiness, like she rehearsed this moment. David stepped out of his car, briefcase in hand. The evening air felt thick with unspoken words. A neighbor walked by with their dog, waving cheerfully before noticing the tension and hurrying past. For a moment, neither of them spoke. 23 years of marriage, and suddenly they were strangers in their own driveway. "I thought you'd be at the office until late," Linda said finally, her voice steady but not unkind. "You usually are." The subtle dig wasn't lost on him. Well, getting divorce papers tends to disrupt the work schedule. He tried to keep the bitterness out of his voice, failed. "Nice touch with the photo, by the way," really drove the point home. A flicker of something, guilt, defiance, crossed her face. "I thought it was better to be clear about everything. No room for misunderstandings." Misunderstandings? David let out a short laugh. Like the misunderstanding that our marriage vows meant something. Or the misunderstanding that while I was working to give us everything we dreamed of, you were... He stopped, the words sticking in his throat. "Living." Linda finished for him. "Yes, I was finally living. Do you know how long it's been since we really talked? Not about the kids or bills or your cases, but really talked." She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture so familiar it made his chest ache. "I spent years waiting for you to notice me disappearing. Years pretending that being a successful lawyer's wife was enough." David felt the old defensive arguments rising. "I worked hard to give you everything you wanted. The house, the vacation property, the private schools for the kids. Things." Linda cut him off, her composure cracking slightly. "You gave me things, David. Beautiful, expensive things that filled up all the empty spaces where our relationship used to be. When was the last time you asked me about my dreams? The last time we sat on the porch and just talked like we used to in law school?" The mention of law school hit him like a physical blow. "And Ryan asks about your dreams." He couldn't keep the scorn from his voice. What could a 23-year-old personal trainer possibly understand about our life? "He understands that I'm more than just someone's wife or mother. He sees me, really sees me." Linda's voice softened. "I know what you're thinking. Midlife crisis, older woman trying to recapture her youth. But it's not about his age, David. It's about feeling alive again." A car door slammed somewhere down the street, making them both jump. They'd been so absorbed in their confrontation they hadn't noticed the gathering dusk, the neighbors returning home from work, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing around their private drama. "Were you ever going to tell me?" David asked, suddenly tired. "If I hadn't been working late that night you met him, if I hadn't seen the way he looked at you during that chance encounter at the grocery store, would you have just kept pretending?" Linda was quiet for a long moment. "I tried to tell you in 100 different ways. The gym membership was a cry for attention. The late nights were an invitation for you to ask questions. Even the passwords on my phone. I wanted you to care enough to ask why." She shook her head. "But you were always too busy building our perfect life to notice it crumbling." The truth of her words stung worse than any anger could have. David remembered all the times he'd absently nodded while she talked, his mind on work. The anniversaries celebrated with expensive gifts rather than time. The way he'd stopped asking about her day, assuming it was filled with the same routines it had always been. "I love you," he said simply. "I still love you." "I know," Linda replied, and there were tears in her eyes now. "That was never the problem. The problem was that loving me became a habit, like checking your emails or paying the bills. Something you did automatically, without thought or effort." She reached into her purse and pulled out a house key, holding it out to him. I'll have my lawyer contact yours about dividing everything. The kids, they already know. They've known for months. I think they were just waiting for us to figure it out too. David took the key, its familiar weight now strange in his hand. Where will you go? My sister's for now. Then, I'm not sure. For the first time in decades, I'm not planning everything in advance. A small, sad smile crossed her face. Maybe that's what I needed all along, the courage to step into uncertainty. They stood there in the gathering darkness, the space between them filled with decades of memories, good and bad, tender and painful. Finally, Linda turned toward her car. I am sorry, she said softly, not for finding happiness, but for hurting you in the process. David watched her drive away, the taillights disappearing around the corner. The house behind him felt suddenly enormous and empty. He looked down at the key in his hand, remembering the day they'd first turned a key in this door, young and full of dreams about their future together. Now that future had driven away in a white SUV, leaving him alone with the house full of memories and the realization that sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes it needs attention, nurturing, and the courage to see what's right in front of you before it's too late. News travels fast in small circles. By the end of the week, David couldn't walk into the courthouse without feeling the weight of knowing looks and hastily hushed conversations. The whispers followed him like shadows, how the prestigious lawyer's wife had left him for her young personal trainer. Each sympathetic glance from colleagues felt like sandpaper against his raw emotions. The first call came from his mother on Thursday morning. I just had lunch with Betty from your father's golf club, she said, trying to sound casual. She mentioned seeing Linda at the cafe downtown with a young man. The pain in his mother's voice made it worse somehow. Why didn't you tell us things were bad, honey? He didn't have the heart to tell her that he hadn't known either. That while he'd been proudly showing off pictures of their Maldives vacation house at family gatherings, his wife had been planning her escape. That the same property had become the backdrop for the photo that shattered his world. Their daughter Kelly called that evening from college. Her voice was small, hesitant, so different from her usual confident tone. Dad, I need to tell you something. The confession tumbled out. She'd known about Ryan for months. She'd seen them together at a restaurant during her spring break visit, had confronted her mother afterward. Mom made me promise not to tell you, Kelly said, crying now. She said she needed time to figure things out, that she'd handle it the right way. I'm so sorry, Dad. I wanted to tell you so many times. David found himself comforting his own daughter about his divorce, assuring her it wasn't her fault, that adult relationships were complicated. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, sounding wise about relationships when his own had crumbled without him even noticing. Their son Ben's reaction came through text. Just heard from Kelly. I know about Mom and Ryan. Been seeing them around town for a while. Didn't know how to tell you. Coming home this weekend. We should talk. The careful lowercase letters, the missing punctuation, it was so like his son to try to make something huge seem casual. David stared at the message for a long time, remembering how Ben used to tell him everything when he was little. When had that changed? When had he become someone his children felt they needed to protect? The evidence of Linda's planning revealed itself in waves. The joint account had been slowly draining for months, money moved in small amounts to avoid attention. Her favorite books had disappeared from the shelves weeks ago. Even her mother's old recipe box, the one she insisted on keeping in the kitchen, even though she rarely cooked anymore, was gone. His secretary Joan, who'd worked with him for 15 years, quietly rearranged his schedule to avoid the charity gala where Linda had always been his plus one. She'd also moved his usual lunch meeting with other local lawyers to a different restaurant, away from the cafe where Linda and Ryan were often seen together. The Henderson divorce files are on your desk, Joan said one morning, then hesitated. I can reassign those cases if you prefer, given the circumstances. David shook his head. I've handled divorces for 20 years, Joan. I can handle a few more. But that afternoon, sitting across from Mrs. Henderson, as she cried about her husband's betrayal, he found himself fighting back his own tears. The house felt different now. Spaces Linda once filled with her presence became glaring voids. The kitchen, where she used to sit with her morning coffee, scrolling through her phone, now he knew who she'd been texting all those times. The living room where they'd hosted dinner parties, her laugh mixing with the background music. Even their bedroom still held her scent, though she'd taken all her clothes and toiletries. One evening, ordering takeout for one, David discovered Linda had already changed her Netflix profile. Her watch list was gone, replaced by a blank template. Such a small thing, but it hit him hard. Another piece of their shared life neatly severed. He found himself scrolling through her old watch list from memory, realizing how many shows they'd planned to watch together when things slowed down. The neighbor's daughter, who babysat for them years ago, waved from her parents' driveway. "Hi, Mr. Chen," she called out, then looked uncertain, like she wasn't sure she should still be friendly. The neighborhood book club ladies, who used to greet him warmly, now hurried past with quick, awkward nods. In his office, David found himself staring at the family photo on his desk. It was from last Christmas, all of them smiling, color-coordinated in winter whites and blues. Linda's smile now seemed forced, her body language slightly turned away from him. Had she already been seeing Ryan then? Had she already been planning her exit while they posed for their last family portrait? He picked up his phone to text Linda about their son's upcoming visit, then stopped. All their recent messages were about logistics, banking information, mail forwarding, who would talk to their accountant. The easy intimacy of their daily communication had been replaced by the formal distance of soon-to-be ex-spouses. The most painful revelation came when he discovered Linda's journal in the guest room dresser. He hadn't meant to read it, but it fell open to an entry from 6 months ago. "I look at him sometimes, working late again, and wonder if he'd notice if I disappeared completely. Maybe I already have." David closed the journal, his hands shaking. The words echoed in his mind, a sad prophecy fulfilled. She had disappeared, slowly and then all at once, leaving him with a house full of memories and the dawning realization that sometimes the biggest changes happen in the quietest moments when we're too busy looking elsewhere to notice our world falling apart. Instead of fighting the divorce, David made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He took a 6-month sabbatical from the law firm. His colleagues were shocked. The timing seemed terrible, with the managing partner position finally within reach. But as he cleared his calendar and handed off his cases, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: relief. The first thing he did was call his daughter Kelly at college. "I'm coming to visit," he said. "Not for a quick weekend, not for a rushed dinner between meetings, but for a whole week." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Really?" Kelly's voice held a mix of hope and disbelief. "What about work?" "Work can wait," he replied, the words feeling foreign but right on his tongue. "I want to see you alive there, meet your friends, maybe try that pizza place you're always talking about." The visit changed everything. Kelly showed him around campus, introduced him to her roommates, took him to her favorite study spots. In the evenings, they talked, really talked, about everything from her classes to her fears about the future. One night, over ice cream at a local shop, she confessed how worried she'd been about him these past months. "You're different now, Dad," she said, studying his face. Less focused on being perfect all the time. It's nice." He understood what she meant. The constant pressure to maintain the image of success had been exhausting. Now, sitting in a cramped ice cream parlor with his daughter, wearing jeans instead of his usual suit, he felt more like himself than he had in years. Back home, he started making changes. The vacation house stalled quickly. A young couple with big dreams and small children. David found himself hoping they'd make better use of it than he had. The money went into a separate account, untouched. Something about it felt tainted now. The empty house felt oppressive, so he sold that too. Found a smaller place closer to downtown, a cozy apartment with a balcony perfect for morning coffee. His son Ben helped him move, both of them laughing at how little he actually wanted to keep from his old life. "Remember when you used to play basketball with me?" Ben asked as they unpacked boxes. "Before you got too busy with work?" David did remember. Sunday afternoons in the driveway, teaching Ben how to dribble, their shouts and laughter going through the neighborhood. When had he decided that court appearances were more important than those moments? "There's a court down the street," David said, looking at his son. "I'm probably a bit rusty, but..." They played that evening, both terrible after years without practice, but it didn't matter. Somewhere between missed shots and breathless laughter, David felt another piece of himself falling back into place. The biggest change came when his old college friend Mike called about a pro bono project, helping immigrants navigate the legal system. David had always supported these causes with money, considering actual involvement a luxury he couldn't afford time-wise. Now, sitting in community centers, listening to people's stories, using his skills to make real differences in their lives, he found a sense of purpose he'd forgotten existed. He started taking better care of himself too. The gym membership gathered dust, but he found a hiking group that met on weekends. There was something liberating about sweating in the sunshine, no phone service for miles, nothing to prove to anyone. Some of the group members became friends, real friends, not just business connections. One morning, about 4 months into his sabbatical, David ran into Linda at their old coffee shop. She looked different, older than in the vacation photo with Ryan, but somehow more herself. They made awkward small talk until she said, "I heard about your sabbatical." That must have been a hard decision. Actually, he replied, surprising himself with his honesty, it was the easiest decision I've made in years. She studied him for a moment. You seem lighter. I am, he said, and meant it. The constant weight of expectations, both his own and others, had lifted. The need to maintain their perfect-looking life had been like carrying around a heavy suit of armor. Now he could finally breathe. That evening, looking through old photos, David found one from his law school graduation. He barely recognized himself, young, idealistic, ready to change the world one case at a time. Somewhere along the way, that passion had gotten buried under mortgages and billable hours and the endless pursuit of more. The photo that was meant to break him, Linda with Ryan in their vacation house, sat in a drawer now, losing its power to hurt. Yes, the age difference still stung when he thought about it. Yes, the betrayal still felt raw sometimes, but increasingly he saw it for what it was, not just an ending, but a wake-up call. His phone buzzed with a text from Kelly, made Dean's list. "Wish you were here to celebrate." Without hesitation, he booked a flight for the following week. The old David would have sent an expensive gift instead, too busy for a mid-semester visit. But he wasn't that person anymore. As he packed his bag for the trip, David caught his reflection in the mirror. Gray hair, laugh lines, a face that had seen both success and failure. But his eyes were different now, clearer, more present. The man who had lost everything was gone, and in his place stood someone who was finally learning what everything really meant. 1 year after receiving that life-changing email, David sat in a different coffee shop in a different part of town, holding the final divorce settlement papers. The morning sun streamed through large windows, catching the steam from his coffee cup. He'd chosen this place because it held no memories, no ghosts of his past life. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter Kelly, just heard about Mom and Ryan breaking up. "Are you okay?" He smiled at her concern. A year ago, this news would have filled him with bitter satisfaction. Now he felt only a gentle sadness, not for himself, but for Linda. He knew how it felt to watch a relationship crumble, to realize that what seemed like an escape could become another kind of trap. He typed back, "I'm fine, sweetheart. How about you?" Their relationship had grown stronger over the past year. Regular video calls, surprise visits, long conversations about everything and nothing. Last month, she'd confided in him about changing her major from law to social work. The old David would have argued against it, worried about career prospects and status. Instead, he listened, really listened, as she talked about wanting to make a difference in people's lives. His son Ben dropped by the coffee shop on his way to work. They did this sometimes now, met for breakfast, talked about life. Ben looked at the papers on the table, then at his father's face. "Big day," he said, sliding into the chair opposite. "Need company?" David pushed the second coffee he'd ordered toward his son. "Already got you covered." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the morning crowd rush past the windows. Ben had started his own tech startup recently, turning down a safe corporate job that would have impressed all their old country club friends. David had not only supported the decision, but had become one of his first investors. "You know," Ben said, breaking the silence, "I ran into Mom last week. She looked different." "Older, maybe," she asked about you. "What did you tell her?" "The truth, that you're doing better than ever. That the pro bono work is keeping you busy. That you've started dating again." David nodded, thinking of the dinner he had planned for the weekend with Claire, a children's book illustrator he'd met through his volunteer work. Nothing serious yet, just easy conversations and shared laughter. It felt right, taking things slow, getting to know someone as himself, rather than as the successful lawyer he'd always tried to be. His phone pinged again, an email from the immigrant family he'd helped get their citizenship. They'd attached photos of their celebration party, wanting him to see the joy he'd helped make possible. The old David would have sent a polite reply and moved on to more important matters. Now he found himself studying their happy faces, feeling a warmth that no courtroom victory had ever provided. Ben reached across the table, picking up the divorce papers. "Want me to look these over?" "I did take 2 years of law school before dropping out, you know." David laughed, a real, genuine laugh that still surprised him sometimes. "I think I can handle it, but thanks a ton." As he signed his name on the final page, David thought about the photo that had started it all, Linda and Ryan at the vacation house. He'd deleted it months ago, finally understanding that holding onto it was like holding onto anger. It only hurt himself. The coffee shop was filling up now, the morning rush bringing in people hurrying to their jobs, their lives. A year ago, he would have been among them, too busy chasing success to notice the simple pleasure of sharing breakfast with his son. "You want to grab dinner tonight?" Ben asked, standing to leave. "Kelly's flying in for the weekend. We could do that new Thai place you've been wanting to try." "Actually," David replied, "why don't you both come over?" "I'll cook." Ben raised an eyebrow. "You cook now?" "I'm learning. Claire's been teaching me. Nothing fancy, but better than takeout." After Ben left, David gathered the signed papers, ready to drop them off at his lawyer's office. Outside, the city was waking up, street vendors setting up their carts, joggers passing by with their dogs. A young couple walked past, holding hands and laughing, reminding him of himself and Linda all those years ago. But the memory didn't hurt anymore. Instead, it felt like looking at an old photograph. A moment captured in time, beautiful for what it was, but no longer defining his present or his future. His phone buzzed one more time. A message from Claire. "Good luck today. Remember, endings are just beginnings in disguise." David smiled, slipping the phone back into his pocket. He had a full day ahead. A morning meeting with a refugee family, lunch with a potential donor for the legal aid clinic he'd helped establish, then dinner with his kids. His calendar wasn't filled with court dates and client meetings anymore, but with moments that mattered. As he walked to his car, he passed his reflection in a store window. The gray in his hair had spread, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but they were smile lines now. The man looking back at him wasn't the polished lawyer from the country club photos, or the broken man who'd received that email a year ago. He was someone new, someone who had learned that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what really matters. Someone who had discovered that the end of one story is just the beginning of another, often better one. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was genuinely excited to see how this new story would unfold.